nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
That's right, it's time for another trip to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Nichodello.
This week, Afghan evacuation mission accomplished. We'll ask a top diplomat about the lessons that have been learned.
We're going to talk to Biden pollster Celinda Lake about what his declining fortunes might mean.
We'll also start counting down the worst presidents in American history.
And we're going to have updates on COVID, voting rights, abortion rights, and Major Biden. But first...
America's longest war is over. After an occupation lasting almost 20 years, costing around 170,000 lives, including 2,400 Americans and 41 Australians. The last American planes took off just hours before a self-imposed deadline to withdraw. Confirmation coming from General Kenneth McKenzie of Central Command.
The last C-17 lifted off from Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 30th, this afternoon, at 3:29 p.m. East Coast time. And the last manned aircraft is now clearing the airspace above Afghanistan.
America's chief diplomat, Anthony Blinken, tried to put things diplomatically.
A new chapter of America's engagement with Afghanistan has begun.
America's President Joe Biden was a little less diplomatic, again lashing out at America's Afghan allies, yet claiming they were prepared for what unfolded or unravelled in recent weeks.
We were ready when the Afghan security forces, after 2 decades of fighting for their country and losing thousands of their own, did not hold on as long as anyone expected. We were ready when they and the people of Afghanistan watched their own government collapse and their president flee amid the corruption and malfeasance, handing over the country to their enemy, the Taliban.
In a terse speech on Tuesday, a defiant Biden again blamed his predecessor for the inglorious retreat.
By the time I came to office, the Taliban was in its strongest military position since 2001.
At the same time, Biden tried to claim credit for ending America's longest war and declared the era of US military interventions with unclear objectives to be over. On the weekend, US drones killed members of Islamic State K, believed to have been planning attacks against Americans.
U.S. Central Command says the vehicle was packed with explosives and posed an imminent threat. When it was hit, those bombs went off and caused significant secondary explosions.
There was no repeat of last week's attack at Kabul airport, which claimed almost 200 lives, including 13 Americans, and US forces foiled an attempted car bomb attack. President Biden is vowing further action.
The United States will never rest. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down to the ends of the earth, and you will pay the ultimate price.
President Biden also spent a lot of time trying to portray a large-scale evacuation as some kind of victory in itself.
The extraordinary success of this mission was due to the incredible skill, bravery, and selfless courage of the United States military and our diplomats and intelligence professionals.
And this invasion in reverse was on an historic scale. More than 120,000 Americans and Afghan allies safely evacuated from Kabul airport. But how many were left behind? There are no official numbers yet. According to one unnamed State Department official quoted by Politico, the majority of them were left behind, Chaz.
Well, we know a smidge more than that because officials say they evacuated about 20,000 Afghan allies. And while estimates vary, a total of 70,000 Afghan allies seems to be on the conservative side, plus another 50,000 who are eligible for the program but hadn't yet joined it. So that's a pretty big majority left behind. But what the Americans tend to focus on are the US citizens left behind.
And we think the citizens that were not brought out number in the low, very low hundreds.
Still no word on how many long-term American residents are stranded there. They never mention them. Could be thousands of them for all we know. But according to General McKenzie, they weren't going to evacuate everyone, even if they stayed.
We did not get everybody out that we wanted to get out. But I think if we'd stayed another 10 days, Louis, we wouldn't have gotten everybody out that we wanted to get out. And there still would have been people who would have been disappointed with that.
It was good of the military, I thought, to cover for Biden's decisions like that. So Biden returned the favour by throwing them under the bus.
The decision to end the military airlift operations at Kabul airport was based on the unanimous recommendation of my civilian and military advisors, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the service chiefs, and the commanders in the field.
Nice try, Mr. President, but it's hard to escape this.
And if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
Not much wriggle room there. And at least some administration officials didn't think Biden's spin was good enough. I am absolutely appalled and literally horrified we left Americans there, said one official. It was a hostage rescue of thousands of Americans, and we have failed that no-fail mission. And I emphasise that quote was from a current administration official. So pretty strong words there, but we are where we are. So the plan from here is to enlist the help of the Taliban. America and 97 other countries have reached an agreement with the Taliban to supposedly allow further evacuations of not only citizens but also Afghan allies. And while you might be sceptical about that, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan thinks a little bribery might go a long way.
When it comes to our economic and development assistance relationship with the Taliban, that will be about the Taliban's actions. It will be about whether they follow through on their commitments to safe passage for Americans and Afghan allies.
So will the Taliban play ball? Maybe. I don't know. But until everyone's home, Biden can expect to see clips like this.
This 3-year-old boy was born near Sacramento. His passport shows he is a U.S. citizen, and he's going through a harrowing ordeal right now, unable to escape Afghanistan.
And also stories about how a brave interpreter who helped rescue then-Senator Biden back in 2008 when his helicopter was forced to land has now been left behind with the other Afghan allies. What makes these left-behind stories particularly worrying are reports that American officials gave the Taliban a list of names of American citizens, long-term residents and Afghan allies to help them get through checkpoints. Basically, they just put all those Afghans on a kill list, said one official. It's just appalling and shocking and makes you feel unclean. That was, once again, a current defense official. What must they be saying about Biden away from journalists? Anyway, trusting the Taliban with the identities of people who are trying to escape the Taliban seems strange from this guy.
You trust the Taliban, Mr. President? You trust the Taliban, sir?
Is that a serious question?
It's absolutely a serious question. You trust the Taliban?
No, I do not.
You trust the country to the Taliban?
No, I do not trust the Taliban.
But to be fair, Jake Sullivan did deny the story.
We have given no list of all of the American SIV holders to the Taliban or any other kind of big list.
Interesting he denied giving any kind of big list to the Taliban, though this story here does possibly connect all the dots. The US supposedly had a secret arrangement with the Taliban where the Taliban escorted Americans to Kabul airport from preset gathering locations where the Taliban would check their credentials. So that might be why Americans could have made small lists if they did. I don't know, I'm just speculating here, but I do know that the issues Biden's facing do not end there. The next issue is the people who did get out. We were assured by the State Department that only Americans and special immigrant visa holders were coming to America, whereas Afghans who weren't part of the special immigrant visa program were being sent to other countries. But now we're hearing that Customs will parole a bunch of other evacuees, which means they'll allow them to stay for at least 2 years, assuming they pass security vetting. That's new. How many people are we talking about there? And what happens to those who fail to qualify for asylum? We don't know. But according to a Republican congressman, there are 2,000 Afghans in Wisconsin right now, none of whom have a special immigration visa, and who knows how many others there are. Maybe because Biden is facing so many of these kinds of issues, his team decided to do some defensive leaking. They suggested the reason why Americans decided to keep the airport gates open on the day that they got suicide bombed, even though they knew they were in danger, was because they wanted to allow their British friends to continue evacuating their personnel. So it's kind of Britain's fault that those soldiers died? Needless to say, the British were not very impressed. Conservative MP Ian Duncan Smith said President Biden was responsible for those decisions. If the American military were very serious about shutting the gates, they would have shut the gates. And he also said to attempt to try and brief against the UK on the suicide bombing is reprehensible, really. So that worked out well for Biden, John.
Not so much.
No. Oh, look, I haven't mentioned the real potential ticking bomb, which is, there was a story a few days ago that when Kabul fell, the leader of the Taliban had a secret meeting with General McKenzie, and the Taliban boss said, either you have to take responsibility for securing Kabul or you have to allow us to do it. And since Biden was so set on getting the troops out of Afghanistan, McKenzie let the Taliban do it. So an understanding was reached that the US would take the airport till August 31, but the Taliban would control the city. So, if that turns out to be true, Biden and his people were offered the opportunity to secure Kabul, and they chose to let the Taliban run Kabul and place the American military, the American citizens, and America's helpers at the mercy of the Taliban. That could become a massive issue.
I think that's what diplomats call a mic drop from the United States. We're done with this place. For more, we are joined by Richard Haas, the president of the Influential Council on Foreign Relations and author of the book The World, A Brief Introduction. He was a senior advisor during the Bush administration at the very start of the Afghanistan war. Dr. Richard Haas, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
So, what were you thinking this week as you watched that final US retreat from Afghanistan?
I'll be honest, it was hard not to feel frustrated, unhappy with what went on. I've been involved in this off and on for 20 years. Indeed, I first went to Afghanistan in the 1970s. So it's a country I care about. I think the United States had opportunities after 9/11 to get it right, and we did some things right, but we also made some mistakes along the way. And this last phase, I found frustrating and disappointing. I don't think things had to end this way. I don't think they should have ended this way. But as someone pointed out, we are where we are. And now the question is, how do we move forward in Afghanistan and everywhere else around the world?
Doctor, before we get to the withdrawal, what do you think were the biggest mistakes of the first 19 years of the Afghanistan war?
Sure. I expect historians will look over these 2 decades and talk about what might have been. For me, though, the United States began by getting it right, by essentially giving the Taliban a choice after 9/11, either get rid of al-Qaeda or we will work with other Afghans to get rid of you. They made the wrong decision. I think the initial phase went well. I think then there was an opportunity for the United States and others and other allies to build up the capacity of the Afghan government so they would become largely self-sufficient. But and as a result, be able to take on both the Taliban and any terrorists. But I think we got it wrong. One, we moved much too slowly. There wasn't enthusiasm for this project in the Bush administration. And when we began to get more enthusiastic years and years later, we made 2 mistakes. One was we built a model for the Afghans that was too large, too dependent on us, didn't make sense for them. And we didn't do enough to prevent Pakistan from becoming a sanctuary for the Taliban. Instead, the United States became a protagonist in Afghanistan's civil war. We then had that odd phase of the so-called surge where we built up, but we put a time limit on the surge, which undermined any potential effectiveness. And then I think moving ahead, the February 2020 agreement entered into by the Trump administration, well, it wasn't a peace agreement, it was an American departure agreement. I was the US envoy for Northern Ireland. We asked much more of the IRA there than we ever asked of the Taliban. We asked the IRA to commit to a ceasefire and give up their weapons. That was never asked of the Taliban. So I think it was a terrible agreement. And then I think the Biden administration made a mistake by going ahead with it. And then lastly, there was the messiness of the final weeks. Things went much faster than the administration was prepared for. So you can look at these 20 years, and I expect historians will, and find many places where, had we done things differently, things might have turned out differently.
Ultimately, though, the return of the Taliban marks this as a defeat for the United States strategically, if not militarily. Do you agree?
Well, it's a defeat. What we don't know is what the consequences of the defeat will be. A lot depends upon what Taliban 2.0 look like, whether they're the same Taliban or somewhat different. But yes, it's hard to look at this, and it obviously didn't turn out the way we did. The president put most of the blame on the Afghans. I think that's unfair. The Afghans fought and suffered tremendously if one looks at the casualties they took over these 20 years. And I think one has to acknowledge that the American decision to leave undermined a lot of their resolve and cohesion, and they all went off to make separate deals with the Taliban. But that said, these 20 years began by ousting the Taliban, and they ended with the Taliban coming back into the country and regaining power. So it's impossible to feel good about this cycle.
Doctor, are you still worried about the Al-Qaeda that's mates with the Taliban, or are you now more worried about the other terrorist groups?
All of the above. Again, these groups are not organizationally separate or defined. Some individuals, shall we say, have multiple affiliations, if I can put it this way. Also, because of what happened in Afghanistan, I think probably some momentum has shifted to these individuals and groups. So in dozens of countries, we've got to continue this long, hard slog. There's no definitive moment at which this effort against terrorism ends. It's open-ended. It's in multiple venues. There's no decisive venue. There's no Battleship Missouri surrender or peace agreement. We've got to be willing to use all the tools available to us. We need partners. Look, this has been a big part of American foreign policy for the last 20 years. I think it's going to be a significant part of American foreign policy for the next 20 or more. I don't think, though, you're going to see new Afghanistans or Iraqs, those kinds of massive military commitments. And what's also different going forward is we're going to have to conduct this low-level war against terrorism in many venues. At the same time, we prepare for more traditional contingencies vis-a-vis Russia in the European theater, vis-a-vis China and what now is called the Indo-Pacific theater. So American foreign policy, American defense policy is entering a stressful era where we've got to deal with this small, distributed kind of threat. At the same time, we've got to deal with much larger, concentrated threats.
In your opinion, is the United States now weakened in the eyes of adversaries and enemies like China and Russia? And if so, what are the implications of that?
Well, this didn't take place in isolation. You had things like Barack Obama's red line debacle in Syria. You had the intervention in Libya, and then there was no follow-up. You had Mr. Trump's abandonment of the Kurds. So there have been other moments in recent years where questions have been introduced about American foreign policy. Now, most of these have been in the greater Middle East. So my own view is the Russians and the Chinese may have some doubts about the United States. These doubts may have been exacerbated by what's happened with COVID, what happened on January 6th, the assault on the Capitol. So I can't sit here and tell you they won't probe. The Russians might not do some probing in Ukraine or conceivably in a NATO country. The Chinese have already been assertive long before this happened in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis Japan. So there may be more probing, there may be more testing, in which case the United States needs to demonstrate to our foes, we need to demonstrate to our friends that no one should generalize on what happened in Afghanistan. No one should see the totality of American foreign policy through the lens of what just happened in Afghanistan. But we may be called upon to demonstrate that.
Dr. Haas, with the 20th anniversary of 9/11 fast approaching, what would you say history should record of that period, and what would you say should be the lessons that have been learned?
I think history might be fairly critical of the United States over this period, that we emerged from the Cold War 3 decades ago. We emerged from 9/11 with tremendous domestic cohesion, tremendous international support, and I don't think we have a whole lot to show for it. I believe we squandered a lot of lives and a lot of dollars in places like Iraq, in places like Afghanistan. In the meantime, to use an American sporting expression, we took our eye off the ball to some extent in places like Europe, in places like the Asia Pacific, and to some extent at home. So if you look at the position we were in with the end of the Cold War after 9/11, you look where we are now, it's hard to argue that we made good use of what it was we began with, and that after 20 or 30 years, I'm reminded of that old Wall Street comment. How do you make a small fortune? Well, you start with a large one. And that's how I feel in some ways American foreign policy has gone. We started with a large fortune, and we don't have much to show for our strategic advantages for our positioning 20 or 30 years ago. And I think historians will be rightly critical, both of what we did and what we didn't do with our absolute and relative power.
Dr. Richard Haas, good to have your insights. Thank you for being with us on Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
American schools are back after the summer break, a break which for some schools extends all the way back to summer last year. But not everything is going to plan. Connolly Junior High in Texas has closed after 2 teachers died of COVID in the space of a week. Since the school returned in mid-August, there have been 51 confirmed COVID cases. The school does not mandate masks for either students or teachers in line with a state ban on mask mandates, but it does recommend their use, and probably for good reason. According to a new report from the Centers for Disease Control, an unvaccinated teacher in Marin County, California, began feeling unwell in mid-May, but continued to work for 2 days before getting tested. In that time, the teacher read aloud, unmasked, despite a school indoor mask mandate there. All of the students were too young to be vaccinated, and half of the class of 24 were immediately infected. They infected others. A total of 22 students, 4 parents and the teacher all got COVID. Now, happily, nobody got sick enough to be hospitalised, much less die, but would a mask have made a difference? Very possibly so, according to the most significant study on masks to date, which was also released this week. This study involved 340,000 adults across 600 villages in rural Bangladesh in what is described by the Washington Post, at least, as the largest randomised study on the effectiveness of masks at limiting the spread of coronavirus infections. Its authors conclude mask wearing can have a significant impact on limiting the spread of symptomatic COVID-19, and that it should basically end any scientific debate, calling it a nail in the coffin of the arguments against masks. So, thank goodness that's over, Chaz.
If only it was that simple, but that never is. Look, that study was fine evidence for the benefits of mask wearing generally, no doubt. Not necessarily for mask wearing amongst school kids though. You see, while mask wearing reduced COVID symptoms by 35% amongst those above 60 years old in that study, and by 23% amongst those between 50 and 60 years old, it made no statistically significant difference amongst 40 to 50-year-olds or for those younger than 40-year-olds. And that's added to the flotilla of studies out there showing inconclusive results about the benefits of mask wearing in schools. Honestly, there are so many of them. Plenty of evidence for mask wearing from teachers, not so much about students though. In the end, the CDC just says most studies that have shown success in limiting transmission in schools have required that staff only or staff and students wear masks as one of the school's prevention strategies. In other words, Having said all that, maybe kids should wear masks in schools because it hasn't been disproven either. And when there's been over 10,000 cases in Tampa schools alone in the first 3 weeks of classes, a number they took nearly 6 months to reach last school year, well, it can't hurt for kids to wear masks just in case, especially seeing as only half of 12 to 17-year-olds has received at least one shot of vaccine so far. Interestingly, the thing that really helps unvaccinated kids stay COVID-free is when their community gets vaccinated. An Israeli study found for every 20 percentage point increase in the share of 16 to 50-year-olds who were vaccinated, the share of unvaccinated under 16s who tested positive for the virus fell by half. But of course, best of all, is all of the above, which is why in August, the counties that were comfortably blue had half the COVID deaths per capita of the counties that were comfortably red. And the counties that were extremely blue had a third of the COVID deaths per capita of the counties that were extremely red. Talking about which, let's go through the numbers. The daily cases continue to rise past 160,000 a day now. Hospitalisations have almost hit 100,000. They might have peaked, but I might have said that last week as well. And deaths are still rising towards 1,500 a day. State-wise, Tennessee, Alabama and South Carolina are leading the pack this week for cases per capita. And if New South Wales was an American state, it would still have the least COVID cases per capita in the country by some way. As far as ICUs go, 6 states have over 90% of their ICU beds occupied, and nationally, nearly 8 in 10 ICU beds are occupied. And let me tell you why that matters so much. This week, a veteran who lived 3 houses away from an ICU was diagnosed at that ICU with gallstone pancreatitis. The doctor said he needed treatment immediately, but there were no beds available. So the staff called hospitals across Texas, Arkansas, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma, but still no ICU beds available anywhere until after 7 hours of waiting. He finally got a tick from a Houston hospital, but by the time they airlifted him, the doctor couldn't perform the surgery that could have prevented his death. That man died completely needlessly. Everyone can be a victim of unvaccinated people filling ICUs. So on that note, to vaccines. And Australian states are now just below the least fully vaccinated state, which is Alabama. I expect by next week at least Tasmania will have passed a few of them. But as for the share of people who have at least 1 dose of vaccine, if Australian states were American, New South Wales would be ranked number 24, Tasmania number 43 and Victoria number 49. But you know, John, when our COVID updates go for 5 minutes every flipping week, you know what that means? You're probably not polling very well.
Yeah, ratings aren't too good either, actually. Well, it is official. Joe Biden's approval rating is underwater for the first time in his presidency, with disapproval of the job he's doing now higher than approval. This week, Biden is down to below 47% in the average of polls. Net approval of minus 0.5. That is quite a turnaround in just 7 months. Back in February, Biden's approval was at plus 19. Put in recent historical context, Biden's 46.7% is not terrible. It's almost 10 points better than one Donald Trump was after 226 days of his presidency, but 5 points behind both Barack Obama and George W. Bush, and Bush's approval was just about to spike into the 80s right after September 11, 2001. Joe Biden is doing a bit better than Bill Clinton was at this point, but almost 20 points behind George H.W. Bush at the same time of his presidency, all of which is to say, things can certainly change. George H.W. Bush didn't get a second term and he was highest of the lot. Now, Joe Biden is only 8 months into a 4-year term, but you really don't want to get stuck in those mid-40s for very long, Chaz. And who better to talk about Joe Biden's polls and what this could all mean than one of Joe Biden's top pollsters. Democratic strategist and pollster Celinda Lake is back with us. Celinda, good to have you with us on Planet America.
Nice to be here.
So we've been looking at these opinion polls for Joe Biden. He's underwater, but is that the kind of thing at this point of a presidency the White House would be starting to worry about, do you think?
Well, I think that you need to contextualize these polls right now. They're a temporary response to a couple of weeks of really disturbing images that disturb everyone, including the president, and that these numbers are still higher than Donald Trump ever was at any point in his presidency.
Of course, Biden's approval went down 3 points before the fall of Kabul. Now, a lot of people point to the economy as one of the reasons his approval might have dropped a little bit before. But why would they be worried about the economy 6 weeks ago in particular? It wasn't that different to the economy in the months beforehand, was it?
I think in general, August was just a month of bad news for the American public. Bad news on COVID variants, bad news because they think the Delta variant is very correlated with the economy, and the economy seems really unstable to a lot of people. Bad news in terms of hurricanes, bad news in terms of forest fires. bad news in terms of Congress being able to come together and get something done. So in general, August was just a month of bad news, as you said, even before you got to Afghanistan. And the people don't blame Joe Biden for a lot of this. They don't blame him for COVID. In fact, they think he's doing a pretty good job on COVID. They don't blame him for the economy, but they're negative about the direction of the country, and that obviously spills over to the president. They want to see what the president is going to do about all of this. What can he get done about all of this? And I think the aggressive agenda that this administration has set for September, squarely focused on issues he's been talking about and has identified with, issues that he's the expert on, issues that he can do something about, I think will be very, very positive for him.
Cilindro, I wonder, in the case of planning a policy like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, does a pollster such as yourself have a seat at the table in coming up with a policy there, or indeed an execution strategy for it, or do they tend to put polling aside on those kind of matters?
No, I think on things that are really critical issues, this administration is not particularly polling driven. And everything that Biden is doing, he said he would do early on in the campaign when, frankly, the campaign couldn't afford any polling. So he's been committed to getting us out of indefinite wars and forever wars from day one. He's had a very different view of foreign policy. He's had a sense that we have accomplished as much as we could get accomplished in Afghanistan. He's had a view of we need to lean into COVID no matter what the polling numbers are. So he's had an agenda that's been set from day one.
Now, I've read that inflation has come up as a concern for a certain kind of voter as well. What kind of voter are we talking about there? And should this be a concern for Joe Biden?
The voters who are most worried about rising prices tend to be working class voters, blue collar voters, blue collar, non-college educated working voters, suburban voters. And they're very, very responsive to the aspects of the Biden plan that do something about rising prices, but they don't tend to be too aware of it. So they're very responsive to the child tax cut, which puts money in people's pockets, very responsive to the administration's push to negotiate lower prescription drug prices. And that's a major, major concern, particularly for voters over 50. So there are a lot of things that supply issue that the administration has taken on in terms of the COVID impact on the global economy. So they are very responsive to the aspects of the Biden plan that deal with rising prices. And that just, the problem is there's so many things going on, and there's so many unexpected things going on, whether it's a hurricane or a forest fire or an international issue or Haiti or whatever, that it's hard to break through right now. That's the biggest challenge for this administration, is breaking through on what they're doing and what they're trying to get done.
Cilindro, of course, it's not just the media that focuses on polls. So do a lot of members of Congress. Politicians look at polls. Will this be weighing on the minds of Congress right now as they consider whether to pass another $3.5 trillion worth of spending?
It could, but I don't think it does in this situation. In this situation, first of all, the lowest numbers of all are the Republicans in Congress. If somebody should be frightened right now about the way their numbers are headed, it's the Republicans in Congress. They're headed deeply south. People really think they're fighting, that they're on a totally different agenda, that they're engaged in misinformation. People are furious at the unvaccinated and politicians who promote lack of vaccination. Women are very angry at politicians who endanger their children. Even Ron DeSantis in Florida, his numbers have been coming down, and he's kind of the spokesperson for the Trump faction, if you will. So I think that in this case, people should be looking at their own numbers. The Democrats in Congress, I think what's going on, both in terms of their numbers and the president's numbers, is it is reinforcing and energizing. Let's get united. Let's get these policies that we are in favor of passed. Let's get something done for the American public. If we can do it bipartisanly, great. If we can't, then let's just get going.
Well, as you said, Democrats would be hoping for a bump from the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill passing. But did they receive any real credit from the American Rescue Plan passing back in March?
They received some credit, but they didn't receive as much credit as they should have. And what happened was, of course, we passed the rescue package without a single Republican vote. But even today, a third of Republicans think Republicans voted for it. And that's because Republican members of Congress went home and said, look what I delivered for you, even though they had voted against it. And it was also confusing because it overlapped. Trump had been doing some things, and then Biden came through with an even bigger package. But people were sincerely confused about who did what when. And of course, Americans are always, what did you do for me lately? So I think that jobs bill and the reconciliation bill, which includes a lot that people really want, particularly women voters, will be accrue much more to our credit. We have our advertising arm up and running ads on what these bills do. And it's clearly going to be, if they pass, it's clearly going to be because Joe Biden got them passed and the Democrats voted for them. So I think in that sense, it'll be easier to get credit than it was for the original rescue plan.
Polls consistently show when it comes to 2024, Donald Trump is still the overwhelming favourite amongst Republican voters. As a Democrat, is Donald Trump the Republican nominee that you guys would like to come up against in 3 years, or do the polls suggest that somebody else would be easier to beat?
I think most Democrats are so horrified by Donald Trump, and it's still so visceral for them, that even though they think he would be easier to beat, they can't imagine having him run again. And it sounds like a horrific alternative, because I think they think it's so dangerous for the country and such a threat to the country. And even though you hope he wouldn't get elected, well, we hoped he wouldn't get elected in 2016 too. So I don't think Democrats are not in the mood right now to make those kinds of calculations, because even if it's a small risk, the risk is way too great.
Finally, what are the character traits or measures that we should be looking to in the polling to know if the president is doing well over the next few years?
Well, job performance is the number one predictor of the president's job performance, and therefore how the party will do. And I think the two key job performances to watch are COVID, which is still net positive, and the economy, which people see as very tied to COVID. And ultimately, in 2022, his overall job performance and his job performance on COVID and the economy are going to determine how the party does, I think.
Celinda Lake, always good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us once again on Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
And now to the Lone Star state of Texas. The Republican-dominated state legislature passed a bill forbidding several voting measures introduced during the pandemic to make voting easier, but which Republicans claim, without evidence, damage the integrity of the voting system.
In a statement from Governor Greg Abbott, he said the bill will make it easier to vote and harder to cheat.
To do that, the bill, which according to the New York Times forbids drive-through polling places, 24-hour voting and temporary voting places. The bill also bars election officials from sending voters unsolicited absentee ballot applications and from promoting the use of vote by mail. It empowers partisan poll watchers while erecting new barriers for those looking to help voters who need assistance with things like translations. Texas is one of 18 Republican-dominated states who've now passed laws this year to make it harder to vote. A major national report into voting rights in 2019 found Texas already led the nation when it came to restrictions like closing polling places. 750 closed in 6 years since the Supreme Court overturned protections in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Well, Texas Democrats didn't have the numbers in the legislature to block the bill, so they went to pretty extraordinary lengths to stop a vote from ever happening.
50 Democrats from the Texas House fleeing to Washington, D.C., all to stop a GOP-driven bill that aims for new voting restrictions statewide.
And for more than a month, that worked. They stayed in Washington despite threats like this from Governor Abbott.
As soon as they come back in the state of Texas, they will be arrested. They will be cabined inside the Texas Capitol until they get their job done.
It's almost as if he didn't really want them to come back. But finally, The Democrats blinked. 3 Houston-based representatives returned, giving Republicans the numbers for quorum, and a final vote was held.
Yeah, look, it's going to be tough for the Texas Democrats to stop this law permanently because they didn't have even close to the numbers, especially given that they went into hiding earlier in the year as well about the same bill. And they'd already extracted a few changes from Republicans of the most obviously discriminatory provisions that were in the bill. Lightning does not tend to strike twice when you don't have the numbers, John.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty extreme filibuster to just say, you know what, we're leaving town. Texas isn't just making it a little bit harder to vote now, they're also making it a lot harder to terminate a pregnancy as well, after the US Supreme Court this week declined a request to act on a law banning abortions after just 6 weeks of pregnancy. Now, according to pro-choice groups, this law amounts to a near total ban on abortion procedures, given that 85 to 90% of abortions occur after 6 weeks of pregnancy. The White House condemned this Texas law as an attack on women's reproductive rights, which were affirmed almost 50 years ago by the court's landmark Roe versus Wade decision. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was particularly critical of payments being offered to people who report anyone who even assisted in an abortion.
This further isolates individuals who are facing this tough choice. And I would note, for those of you who didn't see, people who report, who for these private citizens could get up to $10,000 for reporting somebody who's seeking an abortion.
And no exceptions for rape or incest either.
Nope.
No. But you might be wondering, how did this law possibly get through without being blocked? Because that's clearly unconstitutional, isn't it? The 6-week ban? It's pretty tricky, actually. Normally, you challenge a law by taking out an injunction on the entity that's going to enforce it. It's like the state government. But this law bars state officials from enforcing it. Instead, it allows members of the public to sue the person who performs the abortion, or even helps out with the abortion. So, who are you going to take out an injunction on? You don't know who that person's going to be that's going to sue you. It makes it really hard to stop the law before it starts. The second element of this bill is that you don't sue the patient, only the doctors or the staff members who assist that patient to have an abortion. You could even sue the Uber driver who took the patient to the abortion clinic. And you don't even need to be in Texas to sue someone or have anything to do with the abortion. Anyone can sue the person who performed the abortion, and if they win, they get that $10,000 and their legal fees paid for. But if they lose, the person that they sued still has to pay their own legal fees. So what that means, John, is you could get 1,000 people piling on lawsuits against the one abortion doctor, and they could all end up claiming $10,000 and their legal fees from the doctor. But if the doctor wins, that doctor still has to pay their own legal fees every time for those 1,000 lawsuits. It's a recipe for nuisance lawsuits and driving abortion providers out of business, which is, of course, the point.
What I'm hearing is a lot of work for pro-choice, pro bono lawyers who are going to be offering their services to anyone sued under this. Yeah. I think probably as of tomorrow. We'll see. 53 years after he shot and killed presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, Sirhan Sirhan has been recommended for parole. A 2-member panel of the California Parole Board has found the 77-year-old is eligible for release on his 16th attempt. Sirhan, a Palestinian immigrant, shot Kennedy in the head in the kitchen of the Los Angeles Ambassador Hotel, just moments after Kennedy had become the Democratic frontrunner for the presidency in 1968 with a win in the California primary.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
After he was shot, Bobby Kennedy was taken to hospital. He clung to life for another 25 hours.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
Sirhan Sirhan planned that killing for months, angered at Bobby Kennedy's ongoing support for the State of Israel. But he has long maintained that he has no memory of shooting Kennedy.
I don't remember the exact moment. I don't remember pulling my gun. out of my body or whatever it was located, and I don't remember aiming it at any human being. I don't remember any of that.
There are plenty of witnesses, though. Asked by the parole board about his political views now, Sirhan said, "I think peaceful means are the best way to resolve that conflict in the Middle East." Sirhan escaped the gas chamber when Kennedy's widow Ethel and brother Teddy Kennedy pleaded for clemency, and then the state of California halted executions in the 1970s. Two of Bobby Kennedy's surviving children supported Sirhan's parole application. Former Congressman Joe Kennedy and 5 other siblings opposed it and have vowed to fight this process. This decision will be reviewed by the full parole board, with a final decision to be made by the governor, Gavin Newsom, a fellow Democrat facing a recall election this month. Now, over the last 2 weeks, we've looked at the 10 best American presidents, according to a new survey from historians and experts, with a little help from the voice of Countdown, Gavin Wood. Well, everybody loves a sequel, and we'd already paid for the studio, so this week, let's start counting down the worst American presidents.
Okay, Groovers, I'm back. Don't tell Molly because he'll want 25%.
Deal. Now, the experts used the same 10 leadership characteristics to rate the worst presidents as they did for the best: public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management, moral authority, international relations, administrative skills, relations with Congress, vision, setting an agenda, pursued equal justice for all, and performance within the context of their time. So, let's count them down.
Coming in at number 10 on the list of worst ever presidents, if you guessed Zachary Taylor, you'd be Zachary right.
Taylor was a popular war hero when he was elected president in 1848. He was known as Old Rough and Ready, but he wasn't ready to address the biggest issue of the day, slavery. Would new states like California ban it? What would they do if slaves from other states escaped there? Zachary Taylor owned slaves himself, and he didn't think the president should get that involved, and he didn't work well with Congress. Oh, and he died of what was diagnosed as cholera after only about 1.5 years in office. So he couldn't shake off low scores all around from historians.
At number 9, this guy really sucked. It's Herbert Hoover. You know, Hoover, like the vacuum cleaner, get it? Hoover sucked.
Yes, we all get it, Gavin. When America's 31st president came to office, the stock market's value had doubled in 3 years, but 6 months later came the Wall Street crash, triggering the Great Depression. Within a year, over 300 banks had collapsed. Hoover started a tariff war, 13 million Americans were unemployed, and wages fell for the rest by 60%. Everything Hoover did had little effect or made matters worse. He was thrown out after just 1 term. Not surprisingly, historians give him lousy marks for crisis leadership and economic management.
You really suck!
Coming in at number 8, Warren G, as in G, I don't know what I'm doing, Harding.
Warren Harding was an affable sort of a fellow, a bit of a playboy, in fact, with a weakness for gambling and the ladies. And despite supporting prohibition, he liked a whiskey or 3.
So I handed him my bottle.
On the upside, he negotiated an important post-war arms control treaty. On the downside, he pretty much phoned it in. He saw the presidency as largely ceremonial and was oblivious to the rampant corruption in his administration. He gets lowest ratings for administrative skills, he basically played poker, and moral authority. He really was a bounder and a cad. Harding died of a heart attack in 1923. Some claim First Lady Florence Harding poisoned him, possibly to avoid scandals like the Teapot Dome affair, or as payback for all of that philandering.
When the deal is done.
Now, lucky number 7. He sounds like a petrol station for caravans. It's Millard Fillmore.
Not so lucky after all, Gavin. He was America's 13th president, but he ranks 38th out of 44. Millard Fillmore was sworn in after rough and ready Zachary Taylor croaked it in 1850. To his credit, Fillmore was okay on foreign relations, starting outreach to a rather insular Japan and forcing the French to back off from taking Hawaii, but his Whig party was falling apart. Fillmore lost his bid to be their nominee in 1852. Like others of that time, he couldn't find a solution to the question of slavery, as America headed ever closer towards civil war a decade later.
Counting down to number 6 on the list of the worst American presidents of all time, John Tyler. No relation to Bonnie Tyler. That's a shame because I've heard of her.
John Tyler was never elected president. He was vice president to William Henry Harrison, who we'll meet in a moment. When Harrison died, nobody was sure whether Tyler should become president or acting president. Tyler ended up serving out Harrison's term but lost the support of that Whig party. Basically, there's the same 2-decade period leading up to the Civil War where half the country wanted slaves, the other half didn't. Tyler gets OK marks for international relations. He avoided a Canadian border war with Britain, but he certainly was not the hero they've been holding out for.
This is Gavin Wood speaking. Good night, Planet America.
Rest in peace, champ. Now, you might recall back in March, there was an extremely minor story about the president's dog, Major, biting a security guard. Jen Saki put it this way.
And on Monday, the first family's younger dog, Major, was surprised by an unfamiliar person and reacted in a way that resulted in a minor injury to the individual, which was handled by the White House Medical Unit with no further treatment needed.
So not a big deal. He just nipped a security guard once, caused a very minor injury. We all moved on. Except not everyone did move on. A conservative group lodged a Freedom of Information request just in case. I don't know why they did that, but it paid off.
Really?
Yes, it turned out the Major had actually bitten an agent or officer 8 days in a row, causing damage to their attire or bruising and or punctures to their skin. Now, I don't care about any of those injuries. He's still a good boy in my book, and it's still a very minor story. What I'm interested in, though, is that the 8 days in a row that Major bit someone happened to be the 8 days directly before that press conference when Jen Psaki implied he only bit someone once. In other words, Jen Psaki almost certainly misled reporters about an extremely minor story that doesn't matter at all, which led reporters this week to point out that deception and then to ask her this.
Obviously, that is not the world's most important story, but it is significant because we expect honest information even for minor stories. So can you explain to us why there was a kind of misleading account presented to us? And if we can't get honest information about minor stories, why should we have faith in the administration's account for larger issues like Afghanistan?
The question was clearly not about Major, was it? It was about lying.
Sure.
That was obvious. And this was Psaki's response.
I know you do keep the dog in the news in the briefing room, so thank you for that. As we've stated previously, Major has had some challenges adjusting to life in the White House. He has been receiving additional training, as well as spending some time in Delaware, where the environment is more familiar to him and he is more comfortable. I don't have any additional specifics, but I think that speaks to where Major is located, to be fully transparent in your ongoing interest in the dog.
More like Jen Snarky. Now, yes, we can all scoff at stories about dogs, but that there was the response of someone who lied to the press for no reason whatsoever.
Assuming she knew about it.
Yeah.
In which case, she was lied to and was given misleading information, which is just as bad.
Sure, but then what's her response there? She doesn't care that she got caught. Whether she intentionally lied or she was lied to herself, she didn't give a stuff.
Yep.
I think that's worth remember it.
After what we've seen over the last 4 years, I think you're absolutely right. But that is it for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you back here at or about the same time next week, or on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube, whenever you like.
Which is where you'll find a new PEP podcast, hot off the PEP presses.
But before we go, a 3-hour-long school board meeting in Henrico County, Virginia this week was livened up when it was opened up to public comments, and it seems that maybe a Simpsons fan had made a few additions to the speakers list. Good night.
I'm asking that you do not pass this policy in Virginia.
Thank you so much, Ms. Thomas. We do appreciate you. Phil McCracken. Phil McCracken. Souk Mahidik. Ophelia McHawk. Ophelia McHawk. Eileen Dover. Eileen Dover. Don Kiddick. Don Kiddick. Wayne Kerr. Wayne Kerr.